The rain had not stopped since Chippenham, and by the time the coach rattled through the iron gates of Wrenmoor Hall, Clara Winslow's hem was soaked through to the knee. She did not look up at the house at first. She was too busy counting the coins left in her glove, 4 shillings, a sum that had to last until quarter day, and trying not to think of how the hem of her grey wool dress had frayed past mending. It was her mother's dress, taken in twice, let out once, and worn now for the 4th winter running. She had scrubbed the mud from its collar that very morning with rainwater and a corner of her shawl, and still it looked exactly like what it was, the dress of a woman with nowhere better to be. When she finally raised her eyes, the house took her breath in a way the cold rain had not. Wrenmoor Hall rose out of the mist, like something built by people who had never known want, grey stone softened by ivy, windows glowing gold against the dusk, a house with the unhurried confidence of 3 centuries behind it. Clara had heard of it, of course. Everyone in her small corner of Wiltshire had heard of Wrenmoor, and of the Duke, who had inherited it 2 years past and was said to keep almost entirely to himself. She was not here to meet a duke. She was here because her aunt, the housekeeper of Wrenmoor's East Wing, had written that the old Dowager Duchess required a companion, someone patient, someone plain-spoken, someone who would not tire of reading the same 3 novels aloud until the pages softened at the corners. Clara had answered the letter before she'd finished reading it twice. A position, a roof, an end, God willing, to the particular exhaustion of being unwanted in her cousin's house in Bath, where she had spent 4 years making herself small enough not to be noticed and useful enough not to be sent away. She stepped down from the coach into a puddle that soaked clean through her half-boots, and a footman in Wrenmoor livery looked at her with the specific, practiced blankness of a servant deciding a person did not merit real attention. "Servant's entrance," he said, and turned before she could answer, as if her destination were too obvious to require more words. She did not mind, or told herself she did not. She had learned, in 4 years of being a poor relation, that dignity was not a matter of where one entered a house, but of how one carried oneself once inside it. She lifted her small trunk. She would not ask him to carry it, not after servant's entrance had been said in that tone, and made her way around the side of the house, through a garden going silver with rain, toward a door with candlelight behind its glass. She did not see the man on horseback until she was nearly past him. He had drawn his horse up beneath the dripping eaves of the stable block, still as a carved thing, watching the drive the way a man watches something he is not sure he wants to see arrive. He wore no greatcoat despite the rain, only a dark riding coat gone black with wet at the shoulders, and his hair was plastered to his forehead in a way that would have looked absurd on anyone with less severity of bearing. On him, it only made his eyes more noticeable, grey, unhurried, and fixed, just then, on her. Clara had the sudden, mortifying sense of being seen exactly as she was, a woman in a ruined dress, dragging a trunk through the mud because she had been too proud to ask for help. She dropped a small curtsy, the kind one gives to any gentleman whose name one does not know, and hurried on before he could see her face colour further. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen that he watched her the entire distance to the door, and that something in his expression, not pity, not quite curiosity, something closer to recognition, did not leave his face for a long while after she had gone inside. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread, and for one unguarded moment, Clara let herself simply stand in the doorway and feel her fingers begin to ache back to life. Then, a woman built like a fortress turned from the hearth, took one look at her, and made a sound of profound disapproval. "You'll be the companion," the woman said. "Mrs. Adair, housekeeper." A pause, her eyes travelling from Clara's ruined hem to her damp bonnet. "You might have hired a closed carriage." "I might have," Clara agreed, "had I 4 times the coin I possess." Something flickered in Mrs. Adair's face, not quite warmth, but the beginning of it, the recognition of a woman who did not flinch from her own circumstances. "Well, you're honest at least. Come to the fire before you catch your death, and then I'll take you up to her grace." It was in the passage outside the Dowager Duchess's rooms that Clara met her cousin. She had not known, until that moment, that she had a cousin at Wrenmoor. Not truly a cousin, but a connection close enough that the word applied, a Miss Cressida Vane, whose mother had been second cousin to Clara's own, and who had somehow, through the alchemy that turns distant relations into house guests, installed herself at Wrenmoor for the season as companion to the Duke's younger sister. Cressida was lovely in the particular gleaming way of women who have never doubted their welcome anywhere, and she looked at Clara's dress the way one looks at a stain on a tablecloth. "Good heavens," she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Is that what they're calling fashionable in Bath now? Do sit far from the candles, cousin, or we shall all smell scorched wool." Clara felt the old, familiar heat climb her throat. She had a retort ready. She always did, somewhere behind her teeth. But 4 years of practice had taught her that a companion who spoke sharply to her betters did not remain a companion for long. She said only, "I shall take care not to inconvenience anyone," and continued down the passage, chin level, eyes forward, the particular walk of a woman refusing to be smaller than she already felt. She did not see the man who had followed the sound of voices to the top of the stairs, nor the way his jaw had tightened at Cressida's words. The Dowager Duchess turned out to be nothing like the querulous invalid Clara had braced herself for. She was small and sharp-eyed, propped upright in a great carved bed with a spaniel asleep against her hip, and she studied Clara for a long moment before she spoke. "You're wet through," she said. "A little, Your Grace. And you didn't complain of it to a dare, though I heard you'd every right to." The old woman's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I like a girl who doesn't complain. Sit down. Not there. That chair wobbles. It's been wobbling since the old king was on the throne, and nobody in this house has thought to mend it. There, now. Can you read aloud without making Fordyce's sermons sound like a hanging sentence? The last girl read everything as though she were reading my obituary." Clara, despite the cold still in her bones, felt the corner of her mouth lift. "I believe I can manage something warmer than a hanging sentence, Your Grace." "Good." The Duchess settled back against her pillows, satisfied. "Then you'll do." It was, Clara thought later, the first time in 4 years that anyone had decided she would do without first weighing what she cost. She did not see the Duke again that first night, nor the next day, though she heard of him constantly, in the way servants spoke of him with a peculiar mixture of loyalty and wariness, in the way Cressida invoked his name at every opportunity, as though saying, "His Grace," often enough, might will an acquaintance into being. Julian Ashford, Duke of Wrenmoor, 29 years of age, unmarried, said to have inherited the title 2 years past, under circumstances no one quite explained aloud, and said also, this in a lowered voice, from one of the younger maids, to have grown colder since. Clara filed this away without much interest. Dukes, in her experience, existed mainly as weather one had to work around. She saw him properly on the 3rd day, in the library, where she had gone to find something for the Dowager that was not a sermon. He was standing at the window with a letter in his hand, unread, his attention entirely elsewhere, and he did not hear her enter. For a moment Clara simply looked at him, really looked, the way one looks at a room before deciding whether to disturb it, and saw something she had not expected, not the cold, remote figure the servants described, but a man standing very still, because stillness seemed to be costing him something. She turned to go, not wishing to intrude on whatever weighted his shoulders. "You needn't leave," he said, without turning, "unless you've come to avoid me, in which case I understand entirely." Clara froze, mortified to have been caught at all. "I did not know your Grace was in the room." Evidently. He turned then, and she saw his eyes were the same unhurried grey she remembered from the rain, and that there was, at the corner of his mouth, something that might have been amusement if he had allowed it further. "You are my grandmother's new companion." "I am, Your Grace. She tells me you read Fordyce as though it were an interesting book, which I understand to be a considerable feat." He set the unread letter down. "I am told also that you walked from the servants' entrance in the rain rather than trouble anyone for a dry path, and that when Miss Vane remarked upon your dress, you answered her without either apology or complaint. My grandmother finds this remarkable. I confess I find it remarkable too. Clara did not know what to do with being remarked upon. 4 years of practiced invisibility had left her without the muscle for it. I did not think anyone had noticed, she said, before she could stop herself. I notice a great many things, he said, that I do not always mention. And then, as if he had said more than he intended, he inclined his head and left the room, leaving Clara standing amid the tall shelves with the distinct and unsettling sense that she had been seen, properly seen, in a manner that had nothing to do with her dress at all, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. The small kindnesses began so quietly that Clara did not at first understand them as a pattern. A fire that was always lit in the small sitting room where she read to the Dowager in the mornings, though she had never asked for one, and the room had stood cold under the previous companion. A basket of books left outside her door with no note attached, though she recognized, from their worn spines, that they had come from the Duke's own shelves. A pair of dry gloves, plain and well made, that appeared in her room the week after her own had been ruined in the rain, with no card, no explanation, only the housekeeper's careful non-answer when Clara asked where they had come from. I'm sure I couldn't say, miss, Mrs. Adair said, in a tone that suggested she could say a great deal if pressed, and chose not to. Clara told herself it meant nothing. Great houses ran on such small mercies. Perhaps this was simply how Wrenmoor treated its dependents, and she was foolish to feel her chest tighten each time she found some new, unremarked kindness waiting for her. It was harder to believe that, after the matter of the shoe, she had torn the sole loose from her half-boot on a walk to the village post office, a task she had taken on herself rather than trouble a footman, and had limped the last mile home in the gathering dusk, more embarrassed than injured, certain the whole affair would go unremarked. She said nothing of it to anyone, mended the sole herself that night with a needle borrowed from the sewing room, and thought the matter closed. 2 days later, a parcel arrived at her door, not from any shop in the village, but from a bootmaker in Bath, whose name she recognized from a sign she had passed 100 times without ever daring to enter. Inside, a pair of boots, plain and sturdy and precisely her size, with no card, no note, nothing to mark their origin at all. She confronted him about it directly, unable to help herself, finding him in the estate office bent over a ledger. I did not order these, she said, setting the box on his desk with more force than was strictly necessary. Julian did not look up from his ledger, though the corner of his mouth betrayed him. No, he agreed. I don't imagine you did. Your Grace, I cannot accept. You can, and you will, because the alternative is that my grandmother's companion continues walking to the village in boots held together by good intentions and borrowed thread, and I find I am not willing to permit that, whatever objections you have prepared. He set down his pen at last and looked at her properly. Consider it a matter of household economy, if it eases your conscience. A companion who breaks her ankle on the Wrenmoor Lane is considerably less useful to my grandmother than one with sound boots. That is a very poor excuse, Your Grace. It is the only one I intend to offer, he said, and there was something in his eyes, warm, unhurried, entirely too pleased with himself, that made it impossible for Clara to maintain her indignation a moment longer. She took the boots. She wore them the very next day, and if she found herself walking the village lane in boots that did not pinch or gape or require careful favoring of one foot over the other, thinking of him with a warmth she had not intended to feel, she told no one of it, least of all herself. But she began, without quite meaning to, watching for him. He was not often in company. He took his meals apart when he could manage it, rode out early, worked in the estate office until candles guttered low, and yet Clara found that their paths crossed with a frequency that felt, after a fortnight, too consistent to be accident, in the corridor outside the library at the hour she generally passed it, in the garden where she walked the Dowager's spaniel each afternoon, once, memorably, in the stables, where she had gone to escape Cressida's chatter, and found him already there, speaking low and gentle to a horse that flinched from every other hand in the household. "He does not trust easily," Julian said, not looking round, as though he had known she stood in the doorway. "Neither, I think, do you." Clara came to stand beside him, close enough to see the horse's ears flick toward her, wary. "Trust is expensive," she said. "I have not always been able to afford it." "No," he said. "I imagine not." He held out the brush he'd been using, without ceremony, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to hand a duke's grooming brush to his grandmother's companion. "He'll let you, if you're patient. He does not care for people who expect things of him." Clara took the brush. Their fingers did not quite touch, and yet she felt the absence of that touch for the rest of the afternoon. A small, foolish awareness she scolded herself for and could not entirely put down. She told herself in the weeks that followed that it was nothing, that a duke's notice was a weather system, vast and impersonal, that happened to pass over her by chance of proximity and would move on to more suitable skies before the season ended. She told herself this particularly on the evenings when Cressida held court in the drawing-room, resplendent in gowns that cost more than Clara's yearly wage, laughing at some remark of the Duke's with the easy confidence of a woman who considered the outcome already settled. "He will offer for her, you know," Mrs. Adair said one evening, not unkindly, as she helped Clara mend a torn seam by candlelight, a service the housekeeper had begun performing without being asked. In the same quiet way the fires were lit and the gloves had appeared. "His mother wishes it. The Vane fortune isn't what it once was, but the connections are good, and Her Grace the Dowager," she paused, chose her words. "Well, Her Grace has her own opinions, and they are not always his mother's." "It is no concern of mine," Clara said, and believed it, mostly, the way one believes a thing one has decided to believe, rather than a thing one has tested and found true. She was tested 3 nights later, at a small dinner the Dowager insisted on holding despite her physician's objections, and to which Clara was summoned, not as a guest precisely, but as a companion whose presence had become, without anyone quite deciding it, expected. She wore the grey dress. It was the only dress she owned fit for company, mended so many times its seams told their own quiet history, and she wore it with her chin level and her shoulders back, because that was the only defense she had ever had against a room inclined to find her wanting. Cressida found her wanting within the first quarter hour. "How resourceful you are, cousin," she said, loud enough to carry, "to make one dress serve for every occasion. I confess I could not manage it myself. But then, I have not had your practice." There was a ripple of laughter, the polite, complicit laughter of people who know unkindness when they hear it, and choose comfort over courage. Clara felt her face heat, felt the old instinct to make herself smaller rise up in her chest, and fought it down with the discipline of long practice. "Practice is its own kind of wealth, Miss Vane," she said, evenly. "I have had a great deal of it." It was, she thought, a passable answer, dignified, unbowed, the sort of thing that would end the matter without giving Cressida further purchase. She did not expect the silence that followed, nor the low, cool voice that broke it. "I have always thought," Julian said, from the head of the table, in a tone that carried without seeming to try, "that a woman who can mend her own circumstances with grace deserves rather more admiration than one who has never had cause to try. Miss Winslow's dress, Miss Vane, has survived a good deal more honestly than most of the gowns in this room." The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality. Cressida's face went a mottled, furious pink. Somewhere down the table, the Dowager Duchess made a small sound that might have been a laugh disguised as a cough. Clara did not dare look at him. She was afraid of what her own face might show if she did. He found her later that evening, on the terrace, where she had gone to let the cold night air cool her cheeks and steady her breathing before she had to face the drawing-room again. "You needn't have done that," she said, before he could speak. "I am accustomed to Miss Vane. I would have managed." "I have no doubt you would have," Julian said, coming to stand beside her at the balustrade, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him against the chill of the night. "That is not why I said it." "Then why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had lost its public coolness entirely. "Because I am tired," he said, "of watching people mistake the wrong things for worth. I have spent 2 years in rooms full of women who have never wanted for anything, being told which of them would make me a suitable match, and none of them, not one, Miss Winslow, has ever answered an insult with as much steadiness as you did tonight, over a dress that has clearly been asked to do a great deal more than any dress should have to do." Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. "It is my mother's dress," she said, before she quite decided to say it. "She died when I was 16. I have very little else of hers." Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, she saw with relief, but a kind of tenderness that was somehow worse for how carefully it was offered. "Then it is not a shameful dress at all," he said quietly. "It is a brave one. I am sorry Miss Vane could not see that." "Most people cannot," Clara said. "I have stopped expecting them to." "I am not most people," he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Simple, unadorned, entirely without the practiced charm she had heard him use on other women in that same drawing room, that made her look up at him properly for the first time that evening, and see, in his face, that he meant it. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The night was very quiet, the kind of quiet that makes small things feel enormous. The space between two hands on a balustrade, the sound of a breath, held a moment too long. "I should go in," Clara said finally, though she did not move. "You should," Julian agreed, and did not move either. It was Mrs. Adair's voice, calling for her from the terrace door, that finally broke the moment, and Clara went in with her heart beating in a manner entirely unbecoming to a companion of sensible habits. The weeks that followed had a quality Clara had never known before, not quite courtship, for neither of them named it so, but something adjacent to it, built from small and deliberate moments that accumulated the way frost gathers on a window, unnoticed until the whole pane has gone silver. He began to walk with her, sometimes, when she took the spaniel through the garden in the afternoons. He asked her opinion on books he had actually read, and listened to her answers as though they mattered, which she found more disarming than any compliment could have been. He learned, without her telling him directly, that she took her tea without sugar and preferred a fire built high, and these small accommodations began appearing in her life with the same quiet consistency as the gloves and the books had. She learned things of him too, that he had inherited the title after his elder brother's death. Under circumstances, the household still spoke of, only in careful half-sentences, an accident, a fall from a horse, a grief that had settled into the house like damp and never quite lifted. That he had taken up the burden of the dukedom at 27, with no preparation for it, and a mother who had never quite forgiven him for surviving when his brother had not. That he rode out alone at dawn, not from love of solitude, but because it was the only hour in which no one required anything of him. "You carry it very well," she told him once, in the walled garden, where the roses were beginning to fade toward autumn. "The weight of it. Most men would let it show more. Most men have not had a grandmother like mine, who informed me on the very day of my brother's funeral that grief was a private matter and duty was not," he said, with the dry, careful humor she had come to recognize as his particular defense. "I have had a great deal of practice carrying things quietly. I did not expect." He stopped. "Did not expect what?" "To find someone else who understood the particular exhaustion of it," he said, "of always appearing more composed than one feels." Clara looked at him for a long moment, this man who had every advantage the world could offer, and carried, beneath it, a loneliness she recognized because she wore its twin herself. "I understand it very well," she said softly. "I have been performing composure since I was 16 years old." "I know," he said. "I have watched you do it. I confess I find myself wishing, more often than I ought, that you did not have to." It was the closest either of them had come to saying aloud what had been growing, unspoken, between them for weeks. Clara felt it settle into her chest, like a held breath finally released, and did not trust herself to answer, and so said nothing at all, and let the silence hold what words could not yet carry. There was an afternoon, near the middle of that golden stretch of autumn, when the Dowager Duchess took it into her head that she wished to see the succession house, the great glass-paned building at the far end of the gardens, where Wrenmoor's gardeners coaxed orange trees and rare orchids through the English winter, and declared that Clara and no one else was to wheel her there, for Adair fusses, and my son-in-law's sister talks of nothing but bonnets, and I have had quite enough of both this week. It was Julian in the end who came upon them there, drawn by the sound of his grandmother's laughter carrying across the lawn, a sound so rare, he confessed later, that he had followed it half out of disbelief that it belonged to his own house. He found Clara kneeling by a bed of forced hyacinths, the dowager directing her with imperious little gestures of her cane, and the old woman was laughing, actually laughing, at some observation Clara had made about the head gardener's opinion of the new pruning shears. Julian stood in the doorway a long moment before either of them noticed him, and something in his chest, he told Clara much later, had simply and quietly rearranged itself in that instant. The certainty, arriving all at once and without fanfare, that he could not now imagine this house, or his grandmother's laughter, or any ordinary autumn afternoon, without this particular woman kneeling in the dirt of it. "You have ruined your gloves," he said, when she finally looked up and saw him. "I have ruined a great many things since arriving at Wrenmoor," Clara said, unbothered, brushing soil from her fingers. "Your grandmother informs me it is an improvement on my previous habit of ruining nothing at all." "She has always had excellent judgment," Julian said, and came to crouch beside her, entirely heedless of his own boots, and spent the better part of an hour being instructed by his grandmother in the correct handling of hyacinth bulbs, while Clara watched him laugh, really laugh, unguarded, the sound so unlike the careful, dukely voice he wore in drawing rooms that she felt something in her own chest loosen in answer. It was in such hours, unremarkable and unrecorded, that the two of them built whatever it was that neither had yet found the courage to name. Not in grand declarations, but in the small architecture of ordinary days, a book left open to a passage he wished her to read, a chair drawn nearer the fire without either of them remarking on it, the particular quiet that settled over a room when they were both in it, and neither felt any need to fill the silence with talk. There was, too, an evening in early October when a sudden storm trapped them both in the old chapel at the edge of the park, where Clara had gone to sketch the fading light through its ancient windows, and Julian had come to see to a leak in the roof the steward had mentioned that morning. They sat together on a worn pew while the rain hammered the slates above them, and Julian, in the particular candor that dim light and close quarters seemed to invite, told her at last the story the household spoke of only in careful half-sentences. "My brother was riding a horse I had told him not to trust," he said, staring at his own hands. "I had ridden it myself the week before and found it skittish past reason, and I told him so, and he laughed at me for it, because he had always been the braver of us, or the more reckless, depending which of us you asked. I was not there when it happened. I have spent 2 years wondering whether I might have been, had I insisted harder, or ridden with him, or simply been the kind of brother who did not let himself be laughed out of a warning." "You could not have known," Clara said gently. "No," he agreed, "but knowing that has never once stopped me feeling it was my fault regardless. My mother has never said so directly. She has never needed to. I have watched her look at me, these 2 years, and known precisely what she is thinking, that the wrong brother came home from that ride, and that the least I owe the family now is a marriage that repairs what I could not prevent." He looked up at her then, and his eyes, in the grey chapel light, held none of their usual careful reserve. "I have never told anyone that, not my grandmother, not the vicar, not a single soul in 2 years of carrying it." "Why tell me?" Clara asked, though she thought, even as she asked it, that she already knew. "Because you are the only person in this house," Julian said, "who has never once asked anything of me that I could not honestly give. Everyone else wants the Duke of Wrenmoor. My mother wants a suitable marriage. My steward wants decisions. The county wants a patron. Miss Vane wants a title. You have never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am." His voice dropped, quiet as the rain on the old slates above them. "I find I would very much like, for once in my life, to be loved for what I am, rather than managed for what I represent." Clara reached for his hand, without entirely deciding to, and found it already reaching for hers. "I think," she said softly, "that you underestimate how very much there is to love in what you are, quite apart from the title." They sat like that a long while, hands joined on the worn pew, saying nothing more, needing nothing more, while the storm spent itself against the old chapel roof, and the last grey light faded from the windows above them. And if either of them understood, in that quiet hour, that something between them had shifted past the point of easy retreat, neither said so aloud. Some truths, Clara was beginning to learn, needed no announcement. They simply settled, like dust after rain, into the shape of a life already quietly deciding itself. It could not, of course, remain so gentle. Nothing so quietly precious ever does, in houses where fortune and title govern every match. And Clara had known, even in the sweetest of those garden afternoons, that a reckoning was coming. It arrived in the shape of the Duke's mother, the Dowager Marchioness of Esting, Julian's mother by a second marriage into another great house, a woman whose visits to Wrenmoor were rare, and whose opinions, when she deigned to voice them, carried the force of long habit, unchallenged. She arrived unannounced on a grey October morning, took one look at the ease with which Clara sat beside the old Duchess's bed, book open on her knee, and understood, with the swift, ruthless instinct of a woman who has spent a lifetime managing appearances, exactly what she was looking at. "You are the companion," she said, in the drawing-room later, when she had summoned Clara there directly, without troubling to disguise the purpose of the audience. "I am told my son finds your company agreeable." "I could not say what his grace finds agreeable, my lady," Clara said carefully. "I am companion to the Dowager Duchess. I have not sought his grace's notice. And yet you have it." The Marchioness's eyes were the pale, assessing blue of a woman who had built her entire life on correct assessments. "Let me be plain, Miss Winslow, since I understand you to be a sensible girl and not given to romantic fancies you cannot afford. My son is Duke of Wrenmoor. He owes this family a marriage that secures its position, the Vane connection, or one very like it. Whatever fondness has grown between you in this house is a fondness the world will not permit to become anything more, and I think you know that as well as I do." Clara felt the words land exactly where they were meant to, in the old, familiar place where 4 years of being unwanted had built its careful scar tissue. "I have never presumed otherwise, my lady," she said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. "See that you continue not to," the Marchioness said, not unkindly, which was somehow the cruelest part of it. The sense that this woman bore her no particular malice, only the cold clarity of someone for whom Clara's happiness had simply never entered the calculation at all. "I would not wish to see a sensible girl hurt over a fondness that can lead nowhere. My son will offer for Miss Vane before the year is out. It would be kindest to yourself to expect nothing else." Clara did not weep, though she wanted to. She had learned, long before Wrenmoor, that weeping changed nothing and cost a great deal, and so instead she went to her small room and sat very still by the cold hearth. She had not asked for the fire to be lit that night, some perverse instinct telling her she did not deserve its comfort, and turned over the Marchioness's words until they had worn themselves smooth and undeniable. Of course it could lead nowhere. She had known it from the first evening, from the servant's entrance and the mud on her hem. She had simply, foolishly, let herself forget it in the warmth of a man's attention, let herself believe that being truly seen might amount, eventually, to being truly chosen. She was a companion with 4 shillings to her name and a dead mother's dress to her back. He was a duke. The distance between those two facts had not shrunk 1 inch. In all the weeks she had let herself hope otherwise. She had only stopped measuring it. She resolved, sitting there in the dark, that she would begin at once to withdraw, not dramatically, not in a manner that would require explanation, but steadily, the way one withdraws a hand from a fire before the burn goes too deep. She would take her walks at different hours. She would find reasons not to linger in the library. She would let the small, precious intimacy of the past weeks fade back into the ordinary distance that had always, in truth, been the correct shape of things. She began the very next morning, choosing a route through the kitchen garden instead of the walled rose garden where she knew Julian was accustomed to walk before his early ride, and told herself the small, hollow feeling in her chest was relief rather than loss. She kept to the dowager's rooms in the afternoons rather than the library, occupied herself with mending and letters and the particular busyness of a woman determined not to have a single unoccupied hour in which to think. It did not go unnoticed. The Dowager Duchess, who missed very little that happened within the walls of her own house, watched Clara read aloud 2 evenings running in a voice gone carefully flat, and finally set down her own needlework with the sigh of a woman preparing to say something unwelcome. "You are doing the thing," she said, "that women of sense do when they have decided to be miserable quietly rather than hopeful loudly. I recognize it because I did it myself, once, for the better part of a year, before your grandfather-in-law that might have been, had the sense to tell me I was being a fool." "I do not know what your grace means," Clara said, not looking up from her book. "I mean that my daughter-in-law paid you a visit 4 days ago, and you have not smiled properly since, and I am neither blind nor stupid, whatever my son's mother may think of my faculties." The old woman's voice softened, unexpectedly. "Whatever she said to you, girl, I would ask you to consider the source. Beatrice has spent 30 years believing that love is a luxury the Wrenmoor title cannot afford, and she has made herself and everyone around her considerably poorer for the belief. I would not have you make the same mistake on her recommendation." Clara's composure, so carefully maintained through 4 days of quiet withdrawal, wavered. "It is not my place to make any mistake at all, Your Grace. I have no claim on your grandson beyond his kindness, and kindness is not the same as—" She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence. "No," the Dowager agreed gently. "It is not. But I have watched that boy since he was in short coats, and I have never once, in 29 years, seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not fondness, girl. Not kindness. Something considerably less convenient than either, and considerably more permanent, unless I have entirely lost my eye for such things, which I have not, whatever my daughter-in-law believes of an old woman's judgment." She picked her needlework back up, as though the matter were settled. "Finish the chapter. And for heaven's sake, walk in the rose garden tomorrow. Sulking in the kitchen garden does not suit you nearly so well as you seem to think it does." Clara did not sleep well that night, turning the old woman's words over and over until they had worn a groove in her thinking she could not quite smooth away. She did not know, lying awake in the dark, that Julian had noticed her absence from the rose garden with a good deal more anguish than his grandmother had let on, nor that he had spent those same 4 days locked in the very conversation with his own conscience that would, within a day more, bring him to his grandmother's door, demanding to know what his mother had said, to frighten away the one thing in Wrenmoor that had ever made the house feel, to him, like something worth inheriting. She did not know that Julian, 2 floors above, had just had a conversation of his own, with his grandmother, who had summoned him the moment the Marchioness's carriage departed, and who did not believe in softening her opinions for anyone, least of all her own grandson. "Your mother has been at the girl," the Dowager said, without preamble, from her great bed, the spaniel lifting its head at the sharpness in her voice. I could hear the particular silence of it from here. "Well, are you going to let your mother arrange your unhappiness the way she arranged your brother's, God rest him, or have you finally the sense to choose for yourself?" "Grandmother." "Don't grandmother me, Julian. I have watched you for 2 months. Look at that girl the way your grandfather looked at me before he'd worked up the courage to say so, and I have watched her look back at you with the particular caution of a woman who has been taught not to hope for things she cannot afford to lose. If you let my daughter-in-law frighten her away over a vain fortune that will not even see out your grandchildren's lifetimes, you will deserve every cold, correct, miserable year of the marriage that follows." The old woman's voice softened, just slightly. "I buried your grandfather 40 years ago, and I have missed him every single day since. I will not sit here and watch you choose 40 years of not missing anyone at all, simply because it is easier than being brave." Julian stood a long while in silence, his grandmother's words settling into a shape he had, perhaps, always known, but never let himself examine directly. "I do not know that she would have me," he said finally, quietly. "I do not know that she believes she is permitted to want me." "Then you had better go and find out," the Dowager said, "before my daughter-in-law finishes convincing her otherwise." Clara's withdrawal lasted exactly 4 days before circumstance made it impossible to sustain. It was Cressida in the end who broke it. Cressida, who had watched the Marchioness's visit with the sharp satisfaction of a woman who believed her rival had finally been properly dealt with, and who could not resist, at the next evening's gathering, pressing the advantage while it seemed to be hers. "I understand congratulations may soon be in order," she announced to the drawing room at large, with a bright, brittle smile aimed directly at Clara across the room. "His Grace's mother has been quite clear about her wishes, and I am told His Grace is not a man to disappoint his family in matters of such importance. Some of us," she added, with a small, pointed glance at Clara's mended dress, "were always going to be better suited to Wrenmoor than others. It is simply a matter of knowing one's place." It was, Clara thought later, the phrase, "knowing one's place," that undid her, not because it wounded her, though it did, but because it summoned, with sudden and total clarity, every year of her life in which she had accepted precisely that instruction, made herself smaller, because smallness was safer, mistaken silence for dignity, because silence was all she had been permitted. She thought of her mother's dress, worn and reworn and mended until its seams told her whole history, and of Julian's voice on the terrace calling it brave rather than shameful, and something in her, quietly, refused to be small any longer. "I have never had any difficulty knowing my place, Miss Vane," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake at all. "My place has simply never been where you assumed it was. You have mistaken humility for weakness a great many times this autumn. I would not make the mistake again." She did not wait to see the effect of her words. She turned and left the drawing room with her chin level and her shoulders back, and if her hands trembled once she was safely in the corridor, no one saw it but the dark and the old portraits lining the walls, watching her pass the way they had watched 3 centuries of Wrenmoor women pass before her. She did not get as far as the stairs before Julian caught her arm. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned and found him closer than she expected. His composure, the careful, ducally composure she had watched him wear like armor for 2 months, entirely gone. "I heard what she said," he said, "and I heard what you said in answer, and I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am at this moment, that I do not wish to marry Cressida Vane, or anyone my mother chooses on my behalf, or anyone at all who does not understand, as you understand, better than anyone I have ever known, that dignity is not a matter of birth or fortune, but of exactly the kind of courage you have shown in this house since the day you arrived in it, soaked to the knee, and refused to complain of it." Clara's breath caught. "Your mother said—" "My mother," Julian said, "does not choose my marriage. She has arranged a great many things in this family, and I have let her, out of grief and duty and the particular cowardice of a man who did not expect to inherit and has spent 2 years afraid of doing it wrong. But I will not let her arrange this, not this." He took her hand, carefully, as though it was something that might startle and fly off if handled wrong. "I have watched you for 2 months, Clara Winslow, mend your own dignity in a house that gave you every reason to abandon it, and I find that I would rather spend the rest of my life watching you do precisely that than spend one more day pretending I do not love you for it." The word love, said so plainly, in so unadorned a voice, undid every careful defense Clara had spent 4 days rebuilding. "I have nothing," she said, half a protest, half a confession. "No fortune, no connections worth the name, nothing but a mended dress, and you have everything I have found myself wanting, in a life that has given me every material thing and precious little of actual worth," Julian said. "I do not want a fortune, Clara. I have one. I want a wife who will tell me the truth when everyone else in this house tells me only what they think a duke wishes to hear. I want a woman who wears her mother's dress with more pride than most women wear diamonds. I want you, only you. I have wanted you, I think, since the first evening, in the rain, when you curtsied to a stranger on horseback and refused to let the mud on your hem be anything other than mud." Clara felt tears rise, at last, not from grief but from something far more overwhelming, the sensation, entirely new to her, of being wanted, not despite her circumstances, but because of the woman those circumstances had made her. "Then you had better ask me properly," she said, her voice unsteady with something that might, at last, have been joy, "because I find I am rather done with being cautious about what I am permitted to hope for." Julian's answering smile was the first entirely unguarded thing she had ever seen on his face. He did not kneel, there in the corridor with the old portraits watching. There would be time, later, for a properly staged proposal, for rings and witnesses, and his grandmother's tearful satisfaction. But he brought her hand to his lips and held it there a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had none of its usual careful reserve at all. "Clara Winslow," he said, "will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Not because your circumstances require rescuing, for I do not believe they do, but because I cannot imagine another lifetime that does not have you plainly, stubbornly, magnificently in it." "Yes," Clara said, before he had entirely finished asking, and found herself laughing through the tears at the sheer, unlikely wonder of it. That a woman who had spent 4 years making herself small enough not to be noticed, had been noticed, after all, by the one man in England whose noticing could change the whole shape of her life. "Yes, Julian, I will." The Marchioness of Esting did not attend the wedding, though she sent, eventually, a letter that might have been described as gracious by someone determined to be generous in its interpretation. The Dowager Duchess, by contrast, wept openly through the entire ceremony, informed everyone within earshot that she had known it since the 2nd week of October, and insisted, over Clara's mild protests, on having the mended grey dress preserved in tissue and lavender, for it did more good in this house, she said, than every silk gown Cressida Vane ever wore. Cressida herself left Wrenmoor within the month, her ambitions redirected toward a baronet of comfortable means who admired her without reservation, and Clara found, to her own surprise, that she bore her former rival no lasting unkindness at all, only the quiet, settled peace of a woman who no longer needed anyone's cruelty to define the shape of her own worth. She wore, on her wedding day, a gown of soft ivory that Julian had commissioned without her knowledge from the finest modiste in Bath, delivered with a note in his own hand. "Not because the old dress was ever shameful, but because I find I should like, just once, to see you dressed as extravagantly as you deserve. Wear the grey one again whenever you wish. I shall love you in it exactly as much." She wore both, in the years that followed, the ivory gown for grand occasions, carefully preserved, and the grey one, mended and remended, for quiet evenings by the library fire, where Julian read to her as often as she had once read to his grandmother, and where the particular, hard-won peace of being fully known and fully chosen settled over her like the warmth of a fire she no longer had to ask permission to light. She thought, sometimes, of the girl who had climbed down from a mud-spattered coach 4 years past, certain that her worn dress marked her as unworthy of the house she was entering, and she found she could look back on that girl with tenderness rather than shame, for she had been braver than she knew. That soaked and shivering evening, and the man who had watched her from the rain had seen, from the very first moment, exactly the woman she would become, not despite her faded dress, but because of every quiet, unbroken thing it had taught her to be. And on the coldest evenings, when the wind found every draught in Wrenmoor's ancient stone and the fire in the library burned low, Julian would take her hand, the same careful, deliberate gesture he had used that first night in the corridor, and tell her, as he told her often and meant every time, that he had married the most dignified woman in England, and that he counted himself, of all the dukes who had ever kept that house, the most fortunate man to have simply had the sense to look twice at a woman everyone else had judged too quickly and understood far too late. Clara Winslow, Duchess of Wrenmoor, wanted for nothing after that, not fortune, which she had never truly craved, nor status, which had never been the thing she'd hungered for in all her long years of careful smallness, but only, at last, to be seen exactly as she was, and loved for every part of it. And she was. Fully, steadily, for the whole of a long and contented life she was.